Yo, welcome back everybody to a brand new video here on the second channel, and today we're going to be doing a tier list for San Antonio Regionals. Of course, San Antonio is this weekend. It is going to be the largest regional of all time, so I think it's important to do a tier list video talking about where each deck ranks right now in our current format. I also just did a top 10 best decks video yesterday, so I think it's important to kind of clear the air on that and rank each deck and where I think each deck is, kind of give a bit more of an in-depth look at each deck. I think one thing that really does impact where a deck can lie on the tier list is due to the fact this is the largest regional ever, and the fact that there's going to be a wide variety of decks, mainly because of how open the meta is right now. Can your deck stand up to whatever you play against is going to be the main question. Like, how good is your deck going to be in general? And I think that's going to be a big factor into where I rank each and every deck. Can your deck deal with playing against a variety of different decks? There's a good chance that in the 9 rounds you play against, 6 or 7 different decks. There is a chance that can happen depending on how your tournament run ends up playing out. Of course, I'm going to leave a link down below to the tier list if you want to go try yourself. And if you're new here to the second channel, make sure to subscribe down below. We're on the road to 10,000 subs. I think we're, 400 subs off now? So if you want to subscribe down below, it'd be greatly appreciated. And leave a like if you also went on to enjoy today's video. So let's get into the tier list. Starting things off, we got some Charizard decks to talk about. Now, I think we'll start with Pidgeysard real quick. So I think Charizard, Pidgeot, Rotom, it's tier 1. Charizard does seem like the best deck, or one of the best decks in the format. Now, I don't think, spoiler alert, there's no deck in tier S. I don't think there is a specific tier S deck right now, but I do think that Pidgeysard is one of the top decks at the moment. I also think it's going to be very popular because, I mean, a lot of people go in this regionals. Good chance more, the casual player is going to be attracted to Charizard because it's Charizard. It's, obviously a popular and iconic Pokemon, and it happens to be a good deck. Best of both worlds for, somebody who wants to play it. But I think Pidgeysard is a good deck. The Rotom's very strong. The weird thing with Charizard, despite how good and popular it is going to be, it is weird because I think that actually has a bit of an odd matchup spread. I actually don't think it has the greatest matchups ever. Like, I think your matchup against Giratina and Sableye, Kramer, and Charizard deck are not great, mainly because, Sablezard plays TM Devolution, which is really, really good against Pidgeysard. You have a pretty bad Snorlax matchup usually. Your matchup against Rapid Strike is shaky. And I think your Guardy matchup is also not the greatest. I think Guardy beats Charizard a lot of the time. I think your best matchups are going to be stuff like Mew and, Iron Valiant. I think your Miraidon matchup is great. That's one of the appeals of playing Charizard is you have a really good Miraidon. And I think your other Lost Zone matchups are good if they're not playing TM Devo. Like, even if they're playing like a one of Roaring Moon, I think you're still pretty chilling. But yeah, Zard does seem to have a bit of a polarizing matchup spread, but it does, in my opinion, seem to still be a tier 1 deck at the moment. I think maybe after San Antonio, going into the next regionals, Charlotte or Portland, this deck might fall down a few pegs, but for now, going into San Antonio, it seems like it's going to be tier 1. It's also just going to be very popular. I wouldn't be surprised if Charizard ends up being like the most played deck or the second most played deck. Next up is the TM Evozard. I think it's tier 1.5. I think it's a slightly worse version of Pidgeysard. You're a little bit slower, and you're relying on a Bibarel over Pidgeot. Pidgeot is a great card. You're able to just immediately get any card out of your deck every single turn. Like, oh, I need a boss? Well, let me Pidgey for it. Oh, I need a rare candy? Let me go get it. Or I need a lost city, a lost vacuum? Let me Pidgey for it. Whereas with Bibarelzard, you're a bit slower, and your Bibarel is not as consistent as Pidgeot. You also have to make sure you're thinning your hand down every turn for Bibarel. The nice thing with Bibarel, though, is it's not as big of a liability as Pidgeot is. I would argue that TM Evozard has a better Guardy matchup than Pidgeysard does. But TM Evozard is a bit slower. It doesn't have the, super fast turn 2, double stage 2 setup that you have, but you don't get crippled as much if your Pidgeot dies. I mean, if you're playing against like Lost Tina or something and they knock out Pidgeot, or you're playing against Guardy, they go like Counter Catcher, Iono, knock out Pidgeot, and you have like a 3-card hand and you're just like sitting there with like 3 dead cards, you're like, oh, I guess I lose. So, like, Bibarel isn't as bad, right, for that scenario. But yeah, Charizard's good. I think both builds are fine. I think Bibarelzard is slightly worse, but still a strong deck regardless. Next up is the Mew variants. I think Mew's great. I think Double Turbo Mew is a pretty good tier 1.5 deck still. It did have a pretty good result in Stuttgart, getting top 8 with the Grabber and the Luxray. But yeah, I think Mew is a very strong archetype because it does abuse Judge Path, which is a very good combo, and Mew's very consistent. We'll talk about that in a sec. But yeah, Double Turbo Mew also seems to have a better Charizard matchup because if you have access to Judge Path and Grabber, you can make it harder for Charizard to set up. So over Fusion Mew, Double Turbo Mew does seem to have a better Charizard matchup. I think the downside of Double Turbo Mew, though, is that you don't have access to a big power spike with Meloetta, so you might struggle into decks. Like if you're playing against Tina and they get like 2 Tina V-Stars in play, you're cooked. in my opinion. But yeah, Double Turbo Mew is very fast. Another big downside is Spiritomb is a lot more worse for Double Turbo Mew, mainly because you don't really have a good plan into Spiritomb. You don't play the Fusion Energy. You're not able to really counteract Spiritomb that well, which is a pretty big deal. And there's a good chance we might see some Spiritomb. I mean, Spiritomb is not a bad card to run right now because it's good into Mew, but it's also good against Rotom V, which is also pretty popular right now in Charizard and in Snorlax. So Spiritomb might be popular, and that's pretty bad for Double Turbo Mew. Double Turbo Mew has to draw, like, perfectly. Like, things have to really go your way for Double Turbo Mew to even keep up with a Spiritomb deck, and that is not easy to do. I mean, you have to get lucky with Chromatics. You have to just be drawing, like, almost perfectly to even beat that, and you're not always going to draw perfectly every game, spoiler alert, but yeah, Double Turbo Mew, it's good in my opinion. If you can dodge Spiritomb, the deck seems to be very strong in my opinion, right? Then we got Fusion Mew. I'm a bigger fan of Fusion Mew over Double Turbo Mew. I think both builds of Mew are very solid. Both have a lot of good and bad things about them. Fusion Mew doesn't have as heavy as Disruption, so you offset a bit of a weaker Charizard matchup, but you do get access to a better matchup spread because you have Fusion Energy, which is better into the likes of Rapid Strike and Iron Valiant, and you get that big power spike turn with Meloetta, which can be very good into stuff like Giratina, and you can donk your opponent, and Fusion Energy keeps you safer against Spiritomb because you can put Fusion Energy on your Genesect and draw around Spiritomb's ability. But Fusion Mew, again, does have the offset trade where it doesn't have the big disruption factor like Double Turbo Mew does. One thing I really like about Mew right now is that it does seem like a great deck to play in a tournament where there's a ton of different decks that you could possibly run into. The thing with Mew, it is, in my opinion, the most consistent deck in the game. It draws the most amount of cards. It's like Gardevoir. You're just always drawing cards every turn. You're able to see a lot of your deck in a single turn, and Mew can do that because Genesect's ability is just so broken. You're able to draw so many cards in a turn. A lot of the time, you're going to be more consistent than your opponent's deck. Like, if your opponent's relying on, you know, finding a research, or they're drawing, like, maybe 1 or 2 cards a turn with, like, a Bibarel or something, or like they're relying on flower selectings to get them there. A lot of the time, you're just going to be the more consistent deck because you're drawing more cards in a turn than your opponent is. And that's why I think Mew is a great play for a regional like this where there's over 2,000 players and there's so many different decks you can run into. A lot of the time, you're going to win a game, not because you have a slight disadvantage because you're playing Mew, but because your deck is going to be more consistent than your opponent's deck because Mew can see so many cards in a turn. A lot of the time, you're just drawing more cards than your opponent. You're seeing more cards than your opponent. You're just more consistent than your opponent, and that's a big deal in my opinion. That's why I think Mew's good. Arcpiles, Arcdura is pretty dead. I don't even know why it's on the tier list. The deck is basically unplayable right now, or just it doesn't have a reason to exist. But Arctina, honestly, I wouldn't hate seeing Arctina. I think it's actually a tier 2.5 deck. Like, low-key doesn't seem bad. I think Arcpiles aren't bad right now. The worst matchup Arcpiles are going to face are probably just going to be Lost Tina and then probably Miraidon. Miraidon's not a great matchup for Arc decks, but other than that, I feel like you're okay into most other things. Like, your Mew matchup's not bad. I think your Charizard matchup's pretty good because you're playing Path, and if you want to play the Superior, which some of the Arctina decks that have been getting day 2 at the most recent regionals in our Paradox meta have been playing Superior. So you actually don't have a bad Zard matchup. I think Arcpiles coming back is good because there's also Lost Zone, which is now getting a bit of a resurgence in popularity with all these different Lost Zone decks being popular now. There's a good chance for Arctina to come back. I think Arctina is actually not a bad deck. Putting it in tier 2.5, in my opinion, isn't bad. I think your matchup spread is close. Like, I don't think you have a bad Valiant matchup. I don't think your Guardy matchup Your Guardian matchup's close. I think that you might struggle into, like, Rapid Strike because of the weakness of Urshifu. I don't know, man. Like, Arcpile doesn't seem terrible, to be honest with you. Like, if you play enough switching cards, you're probably favored into Snorlax because you do have Giratina V, which has Shred, which just bodies Snorlax. Yeah, I actually don't hate Arcpiles. I don't think they're terrible right now, and I think Arctina might be the best way to play the Arc deck right now because Judge Path, and you have good typing with Superior, and you can capitalize on the popularity of decks that Arcpiles usually were good against, like Lost Box and Mew, because you can play like a Spiritomb or something, or like a Drapion. You know what I mean? So, there you go. Next up, we have Chien-Pao. Chien-Pao has definitely fallen off recently. It's honestly a tier 2.5 deck. I don't know, man. Chien-Pao just feels really bad right now. Its best matchups are probably going to be like maybe Charizard, and honestly, that might be about it. Like, I feel like your matchups are just kind of weak around the board. I mean, I guess your Guardy matchup isn't terrible either because you do have Iron Hands, but everything else feels pretty bad. Like, obviously, I think your Snorlax matchup's always been bad for Chien-Pao. I think you don't have a great Sablezard matchup. I think that your Rapid Strike and Valiant matchup's also not great either. But I don't know, man. Shenpao's definitely fallen off. I mean, bro, there was not a single Shenpao in Day 2 Stuttgart. It's crazy because we were all calling Shenpao Hands like one of the best decks in the meta heading into like LAIC, and then it underperformed at LAIC, and then it continued to just keep flopping, and we're at the point now where Shenpao just might not be good right now. I don't think the meta is great for Shenpao, I'm going to be honest with you. I don't think the format isn't a great place for Shenpao, and I think that Shenpao is just weak. I do think we're going to see some big players to play it, because there are, those, the casual Shenpao players out there. We know that there are, Shenpao stands in our region, right, that do play the deck a lot, but I just don't think the deck is very good. I wouldn't expect to hit one in day one. You could, because a big regional, but overall, it does seem like a pretty bad deck. It just feels bad to play right now. It's also a deck that is very combo-based, and it's very bricky, and sometimes you just can't get your combo pieces, and you just kind of get destroyed. Yeah. Iron Valiant Entei, honestly, probably tier 1.5. Not a bad deck either. I think that it's maybe weaker than Rapid Strike overall, but I'm going to be biased with you. I do think that Entei Valiant is still a pretty solid deck. It can go toe-to with a lot of these big decks. It has, leg room, wiggle room for whatever you want to play. I mean, I've seen Sunless play Tomb. You still have that Radiance Art, which is fantastic. You get to donk your opponent, which is really good. I do think that you will struggle in a Charizard if you're not able to capitalize on KOing their Charmanders quick enough, because you're probably going to lose to Charizard if they get to set up, because it's really tough to deal with the Charizard. You do have TM Devo in the deck, so you might be okay if you can start de-evolving stuff, but it doesn't feel great. But yeah, I do think that Entei Valiant's good. I think your worst matchup's probably Rapid Strike. Rapid Strike is an abysmal matchup because of Rapid Strike and Teleon. Miraidon's also a kind of a close matchup. Guardy seems like it's an okay matchup for the deck. I think you're good into maybe Snorlax, but yeah, I think that Entei Valiant is not terrible. Probably still a tier 1.5 deck right now, or maybe tier 2. Actually, you know what? No, I'm more thinking about it's probably tier 2. Next up, we have Guardy. Now, Guardy definitely feels like it's the other tier 1 deck. I don't think Guardy's S tier anymore. I don't think it's, where it was heading in to LAIC, where it was the BDIF, but Guardy is, in my opinion, one of the 3 best decks right now. It has good matchups. It's very strong, very consistent, and I also think it'll still be decently popular. I think a lot of big players and good players are going to be on Guardy in San Antonio. So yeah, Guardy's also, in my opinion, still a tier 1 deck. I think that while the deck has been, not doing as well as it would have been for LAIC or as hyped up, the deck is still a very strong deck, and I think it is still, in my opinion, just a tier 1 deck. It is one of the top decks in the format right now, for sure. Goldengo, probably Rogue bad. I want Goldengo to be good, man. It's a cool deck, and it's been having, weirdly good online tournament results, but I don't know if it's going to translate to a good result in San Antonio, but for now, we're going to put in the Rogue bad category. Rapid Strike Urshifu, with Inteleon is definitely, in my opinion, tier 1.5 deck. Actually does seem to be a strong candidate right now for one of the best decks if you're setting up, because the deck itself can be a pile. It can be very bricky. A lot of the times when you're playing Rapid Strike, you get these just unplayable hands, and it's just no fun for anyone. Because believe me, when the deck kind of gets rolling, it's pretty good. I think it's got a great matchups. I mean, you got the TM Devos, so you're good into Guardian Charizard. You're always good into Lost Zone variants. You have Urshifu, which is great for Miraidon. It feels like this deck is just an insane deck right now. What does it lose to? I mean, Mew's obviously going to be one of your harder matchups, but other than that, I think that the deck is just insane, and I think it beats a lot of stuff. I mean, I guess Snorlax is also kind of a shaky matchup, but yeah, Rapid Strike seems like it is posed to be one of the best decks in the format. It's just, ultimately, it can be very inconsistent, very clunky. You can get some really bad draws, but a good player, I think, can really do well with Rapid Strike. I mean, there's a reason why we saw 2 of them in top 8 at Stuttgart. I think the deck is legit very good right now. I don't think we can call it a tier 1 deck, but I definitely think we can call it a tier 1.5 deck. It is one of the higher echelons of decks right now. I think it's a very strong deck. It has a great matchup spread across the board, and if Lost Zone decks are going to start coming back now after Stuttgart, it's a great reason to once again pick up Rapid Strike and keep playing it. Next up is Klawf. Klawf's tier 2. It's actually not that bad of a deck. I think that it does have awkward matchups. I think your Guardian matchup's terrible. Your Mew matchup's also pretty abysmal. But you're okay into most other decks. I mean, you have a good Miraidon matchup. You have a pretty good Charizard matchup thanks to Electrode. Yeah, ironically enough, Klawf isn't even that bad of a deck right now. So, you know what? We got to put it in tier 2. And it's not, I don't think it's tier 2.5. I actually think Klawf is, kind of tier 2. Probably, the bottom of the barrel in tier 2. I would say it's maybe, the last deck in tier 2. Almost in tier 2.5. But Klawf's actually not, ironically enough, not a bad deck. You just hit a bunch of Miraidons and Zards, bro, and you're chilling. Next up, we have Lugia. So Lugia is definitely in an interesting spot. It has fallen off a lot recently, and we start off with Colorless Lugia, which I think is tier 2.5. Colorless Lugia feels like it's just kind of mid right now. It doesn't really do anything special, in my opinion, mainly because it doesn't really have the greatest time into some of the decks. Like, I guess, like, with Lost Zone, once again, coming back, it's not a bad deck to play if Lost Zone does want to return. But I think your matchup spread is just awkward. I think your Zard match has been shaky. I think Guardy's really tough now for Lugia, mainly because they can use Screamtail and knock out your Archeops. I think if you're going to play Lugia, you might have to consider playing Manaphy, because you just get destroyed by Screamtail, because they'll just start Screamtailing your Archeops, and, like, what are you going to do? So Lugia definitely feels like it's a little weak right now, and Miraidon's also never been a great matchup either, but it's not the worst deck. Like, when Lugia sets up turn 2 Archeops, it's still a very big threat, in my opinion. Now, Colorless Lugia might be the weakest version of Lugia, because I do think that Lugia Iron Hands and Single Strike Lugia are slightly better. I think they're all just tier 2.5 decks. I don't think Lugia is any worse than a tier 2.5 deck. I mean, there's still like a couple Lugias getting day 2 of these tournaments, and I don't think it's really that bad of a deck. Like, looking at its matchup spread, it's not terrible. I mean, Rapid Strike's pretty good right now. Mew's pretty good. Those are all like okay matchups. Like, Single Strike Lugia can beat Mew because you got Dark in the deck. You got, a good Rapid Strike matchup usually, which is nice. Like, the Lugia decks don't seem terrible. It's just polarizing because you also have a really awkward Zard matchup. Your Guardy matchup can be tough because of Screamtail. Like, if you're playing against a good Guardy player, they'll just Screamtail your Archeops and then GG's, right? But, like, you're not bad against other stuff. Like, I think your Entei Valiant matchup's good. Your Mew matchup can be good. Your Rapid Strike matchup can be good. Your Miraidon matchup is ultimately going to be shaky, but I also think your Lost Zone matchups aren't bad either. That's another big thing I like about Lugia is your Lost Zone matchups aren't terrible. So, I don't know, man. Lugia, it's not a terrible deck, but I don't think it's very good. I personally wouldn't recommend playing it, but it's not the worst deck ever. But it's just scary because, again, your Zard matchup's so bad. I think that's, like, the big selling point is Zard and Miraidon seem like bad matchups for Lugia. When you're taking a bad matchup, potentially the 3 best tier 1 decks, it's just maybe not worth playing Lugia, in my opinion. Lost Zone Charizard is interesting. This got top 8 in Stuttgart, so all of a sudden this is now a thing. How good is Lost Zard really, though? So, probably tier 2, let's be real here. I do think the deck has some plays it can make. I mean, again, you do have one-prizers like Cram, and you have the Sableye, which can be really good in the early game instead of immediately just rushing with Charizard. The problem is the deck is not as consistent as it could be. You're relying on the Lost Zone engine to get you rare candies. You have to rely on Colress and Comfey and Greninja sometimes, which isn't terrible. I mean, you are drawing a lot of cards in a turn. Like, the chances you can find rare candies aren't that low because you are drawing so many cards. But then you also don't really have an engine in the back half of the game. You don't have Pidgeot or Bibarel, so you're not able to really play around stuff like Judge and Iona, which is kind of scary. And ultimately, you just tend to be a little clunky. But if the deck flows pretty well and your opponent's not spamming Judge and Iono, the deck's probably not terrible, to be honest with you. It's just, it doesn't have that big engine that the other Zard decks has, and I think that's the main downside of it. It did get top 8, so clearly the deck has potential. Clearly the deck is something, and it's not a terrible deck whatsoever, but I do think it's just kind of mid overall, but it's not bad. I think it's a decent tier 2 deck, to be honest. Next up is Goodra. Lost Goodra's probably tier 2.5. I don't know, actually. That's a tough one. It's either Rogue or tier 2.5. We'll put it in the Rogue bad category for now. Goodra's okay. Like, I actually don't think it's terrible. Like, it doesn't have the worst matchups, in my opinion, but it does kind of get caught in the crossfire of stuff like Jirachi scene play, and Goodra's not the greatest card at the moment. It's not bad into some matchups. Like, I think you're good into, obviously, Zard could be decent. Maybe Guardy's not bad, but I don't know. Like, Miraidon could be good too, I guess. But I don't know, man. Like, Goodra just seems kind of weak right now. I don't think there's anything special about it. It's not a terrible deck by any means. Like, I could see one slipping through the cracks and getting day 2, but outside of that, I don't think the deck is, like, that good. I think it's just kind of overall just mid. It's okay. Again, there's a world where somebody could get day 2 with it. It's not out of the picture. It does have some okay matchups. People sometimes don't know how to play against it properly, which can be a big deal too. Like, it is threatening when you're just Goodraing them for 200 and tanking hits, but ultimately I think Goodra's kind of mid. It's not bad, but not great either. Lost Tina, probably tier 1.52. It's definitely one of the higher placing tier 1.5 decks up there with the Rapid Strike deck. If I guess we were to order the tier, we could do something like this. But yeah, no, I definitely think Tina's a pretty strong deck right now. It is like Rapid Strike, though. The deck, in theory, seems like it's good. Like, it looks appealing. Like, okay, its matchup spread is good. The deck does so many good things right now in the meta. This has to be good. But then you play Tina, and then you're just getting these really bad draws. You're getting these really painful Lost Zone selections, and you're bricking really hard, and the deck just sucks. And that's really the story of playing Lost Tina. It's like Rapid Strike. Like, if the deck sets up and you're running smooth, the deck's insane. But when the deck a lot of the time just doesn't want to work properly. The deck, it feels so bad. And Tina and Rapid Strike are both good examples of just like kind of bricky decks that just don't really have much going for them when they're bricking. And it's just like, in theory, they look really good, but then when you play them, it's like, ooh, it actually feels kind of bad. But they're both decent decks right now. I think both Lost Tina and Rapid Strike are good. Lost Tina's not bad. It has a great Charizard matchup. I think your Guardian matchup's not bad either. Miraidon is a little sketchy. Your Mew matchup's okay. Yeah, your matchup spread's not bad. That's the thing. I mean, you might be weaker into like the Sableye Cramorant Charizard deck though, which is a bit of a big deal. But you do get access to a lot of counterplay, like Countercatcher, Roxanne, Iono, Path, which is a very big deal. Those are some of the main selling points to wanting to play Lost Tina. I think Sablezard is a pretty good tier 1.5 deck now too. I've always thought this was the better way to play Lost Zone right now, but yeah, Sablezard definitely is very strong. It did just win Stuttgart, which is big for the deck, but also bad because it does put a bit of a target on its back where it's like, okay, I got to start playing Jirachi now, and maybe I got to play Lost City. But yeah, Sablezard's a very strong deck. I think that it's a good deck. It's got good matchups. I think your Zard matchup's good. Your Miraidon matchup should be good if you can immediately respond to Iron Hands. If you're not able to respond to Iron Hands quick enough, you're probably just going to lose. If Iron Hands can take 2 knockouts against you, game's probably over. But if you can immediately Charizard the Iron Hands, you're chilling, because, I mean, the deck's got double turbo, it's got Mirage Gate, it's got Raihan, it has the answers to counteract the Iron Hands EX. But I think Sablezard's still not a terrible deck for San Antonio. It still seems very strong. Yeah, people are going to be respecting the Lost Zone a bit more, so, like, you're going to see more Jirachi now. You're going to maybe even see more, like, Lost Cities and Judges and just more shenanigans that a deck like Sablezard does not appreciate, but I still don't think it's a terrible deck whatsoever right now in our meta. Next up is good old Miraidon, another tier 1 deck by far. Miraidon is definitely in the tier 1 category. Again, there is no like BDIF, there's no best deck in the format, there's no tier S deck, but Miraidon is up there with Guardian Zard as one of the better decks in our meta, one of the best decks, and not to mention, I think it's going to be very popular. So there's a good chance Miraidon ends up being the most popular deck in San Antonio. There's a very good chance. It's a very big tournament. A lot of newer players can be attracted to a deck like this. It's a very, very attractive beginner deck. Miraidon's very easy to play. Doesn't really require much, thought. It's very just straightforward deck. Just does what it does, goes fast, knock out stuff very quickly, generator, go hot. The deck's just very simple at what it does. And I think that's appealing to a lot of players going to their first regionals. And I think it's just also one of the best decks right now. A lot of those two things really clash together to make Miraidon potentially the most played deck in San Antonio. There's a very good chance that day one we see Miraidon being the most popular deck. And Miraidon's scary. I mean, a lot of people always call it mid-Rhydon, but I think now that it has Iron Hands, and we're seeing stuff like the Judge Path come back, which we saw in the second place list at Stuttgart, I think Miraidon's definitely now a lot scarier than maybe it was going into San Antonio. So yeah, Miraidon's still a strong deck. Definite tier 1 deck. Definitely a deck you need to make sure you test against and know how to play against the matchup, or at least play a deck that has a good Miraidon matchup or a favorable Miraidon matchup. Because you want to take a bad matchup Miraidon, dude, I don't know about that. When there's a good chance it's the most popular deck in the room, I don't know, man. Doesn't seem like a good idea. Palkia Ice Rider is kind of cute. I actually don't think it's a bad deck. I think it's maybe tier 2 right now. It's not the worst deck on the planet. I think one of the things that makes Palkia good is that it's just a very straightforward and consistent deck. It feels like it reminds me a bit of like Mew and Miraidon. It just does what it does, just hits hard, takes knockouts very easily, very straightforward, very simple deck. You just need you got Star Portal, you got Melanie to charge it up, you're doing a ton of damage. The thing with Palkia, though, is it doesn't have a great Zard matchup. I don't know how you can fix the Zard matchup, whether or not you want to play like Articuno or something. Your Zard matchup does seem a little tough, but it seems like it's a great deck. I think you have a good Mew matchup. I think you have an okay Guardian matchup if you can pull off the Greninja Cologne Cross Switcher play quick enough. I think your Entei Valiant matchup is fantastic. I think you have a good Miraidon matchup thanks to the Ice Rider, and you're just trading very effectively into Miraidon anyways. Yeah, and I think you got a good Lost Zone matchup. You can start teching in stuff like Lost Cities. I think your Lost Zone matchups become a lot more favorable too. You just got to get over the hurdle of having a rough Zard matchup. And if you can figure out how to make the Zard matchup playable, Palkia is not a terrible deck in my opinion to play. I think it's actually not a bad deck whatsoever. Well, I guess the other thing I want to note, I don't think you have a great Tina matchup. Tina seems like a sketchy matchup. Rapid Strike is also a close one in my opinion. Those two matchups are going to be very close, but I think Palkia is still a great deck. It's got a good matchup spread. Zard's arguably a worse matchup. If you can figure out how to fix the Zard matchup, or you have a strategy of how to approach the matchup, I think it's good. I actually don't hate Palkia. I actually think it's a cool deck, and I don't think it's bad. Snorlax, for now, I think it's tier 2. I think Snorlax has fallen a few pegs down. Yeah, it won a regionals, and people were in panic, like, oh no, the end of the times is here, control's back. But Snorlax definitely has fallen off a little bit. I still think it's a great deck, but the other thing with Snorlax is you don't really need to respect it. Yeah, we're in a massive tournament. There's a higher chance you'll run into Snorlax if there's more players, but I also don't think many people are going to bring Snorlax because it does feel like we're at the point now where we figured it out. We all know how to beat it. We all know how to play against it. Like, Snorlax can prey on the Charizard players who don't tech for it. It can prey on the decks that just don't tech for it. But now that, like, Lost Zone decks are coming back, it's bad for Snorlax, and I just don't think the deck is great. And I also don't think you're going to run into it that often in the tournament. Like, there's a pretty good chance you hit, like, no Snorlax in day 1, maybe day 2, depending on what your record is. But ultimately, the odds you hit Snorlax day 1 at San Antonio aren't very high. I ultimately don't think that many people are going to play it. It will be played. I'm not saying it's not going to be played, but I just don't think that many people are actually going to play it. Like, the casual player going to a regionals, like, they're not going to bring Snorlax, in my opinion. They're going to bring Miraidon, or they're going to bring Charizard, or they're going to bring, you know, Tina or something. Not Snorlax. So, like, I don't know. I don't even think you need to respect it. If you're playing Charizard, just whatever. I'm not playing Minior. Who cares? You know what I mean? Also, a good Snorlax player will be able to counter the counters. A good Snorlax player will be able to play around stuff like Minior. I don't think Minior is the greatest counter right now when you have stuff like Defiance Vest and Mawile, which are very good at beating the Minior. So, ultimately, a good Snorlax player is going to beat you anyways, even if you play Minior. Don't bother teching for it. That's just my take, in my opinion, you know? Next up is the Lost Zone Roaring Moon Hands deck. I mean, you can classify this as, like, Tord Pile, or even, like, the deck that got top 4 with the Super Effect Glasses. Probably a decent tier 2 deck right now. I definitely think that the Lost Zone decks are good, but I think they are now getting respected a little bit more going into this tournament after they had such a good performance at Stuttgart. But I do think that these, like, Lost Zone decks are decent. And I can classify, like, Turbo Lost Box or, like, Dragonite also there. Dragonite, with Roaring Moon and Iron Hands, has been kind of making a bit of a resurgence recently in, like, League Cups and stuff. And, yeah, I think that both Lost Zone decks are fine. They're both decent tier 2 decks. Like, you can play them, do well. The odds that you hit one, they're not very low. Like, I think there is a chance you could hit one, but I ultimately wouldn't be like, oh, they're not going to be that popular. Like, maybe you run to, like, 1. But if they do get caught in the crossfire of these Lost Zone decks doing good, like Sablezard, and then Jirachi's going to be more popular. But I don't think they're terrible. I think that they're both decently solid tier 2 decks. Like, there's a world where maybe you can put them in tier 1.5. I don't know. But I think for now, call them tier 2s. Maybe top of the tier 2. Turbo Roaring Moon, probably a tier 2 deck too. Oddly enough, Roaring Moon has been getting decent placements outside of the top 8 in some of these recent European regionals, which is a big deal because a lot of people, when they look at these regionals, they're just looking at the top 8. They don't really care about what's around it. Outside the top 8, you got to respect what's outside the top 8 too. And Roaring Moon got 9th in Stuttgart. I actually think Turbo Roaring Moon is starting to make a name for itself. It's starting to actually have some decent results. There was actually quite a few of them in Gdansk. Like, the deck is doing okay right now. And honestly, it's not a bad tier 2 deck. It might be waiting for its moment to crack into top 8. I'm going to be honest with you. There's a chance that could happen. There might be a bit more Roaring Moon Turbo this time around heading into San Antonio. Urshifu Valiant, probably tier 2.5. There's been a few Urshifu Valiant decks in day 2 of these European regionals, but I don't know how good the deck is. I also don't think it's going to be heavily played compared to Entei Valiant, which is proven to be the better way to play it, but I don't know, maybe Urshifu Valiant's actually that good. Again, with all the Miraidon running around, it's probably not the worst deck you can play. I don't know, Urshifu Valiant's probably not terrible. It's been getting, like, okay results in these European regionals. I don't know if anyone's going to pick up on that and then decide to play it, but we'll see. And then finally, we got Zorobox, probably Rogue, bad deck. I actually want Zorobox to be really good, and, like, in theory, it seems like it's good. Like, I think it can beat anything. Honestly, I think it can beat anything. I think it can beat Miraidon. You got Cleaver. It can beat Charizard. You got Scovillain, and you can play Jolteon to beat Pidgeot if they attack you with it. You're probably just going to struggle against Rapid Strike, and maybe Entei Valiant are your 2 worst matchups, but overall, you probably don't have to worry about those as much, because you're beating Mew, you're beating Guardy, you can beat the Lost Zone decks thanks to the Scizor and Jirachi Manaphy. You're beating Palkia probably. I mean, Control you can beat. If you want to tech for Control, you can. You can play the Togetic Turo or Gyarados, Wugtrio, whatever. I don't know. But yeah, I actually think that Zorobox, like, on paper, seems like it can beat a lot of decks. I think on paper, it seems like an insane deck. But the issues lie, it's very inconsistent. It's kind of clunky. Can draw poorly sometimes. It's a lot of the time when I lose with the deck, it's because I can't find a supporter by my 2nd turn or 3rd turn of the game, and I'm too far behind to win at that point. Like, there's issues with the deck, but in theory, it beats a lot of stuff, but I just think in practice, it's just not great. But I like Zorobox. I'm always going to root for this deck. It's one of my favorite decks, but we'll see where it ends up. But there you go. That is my tier list for San Antonio Regionals. I think that the meta is very diverse, and there's a chance that you can hit anything here in tier 2 and above. honestly, there's a good chance you can get any of these 2 decks. I mean, Chien-Pao hands might be, I mean, I might be dissing the deck too hard to put in tier 2.5, like maybe respectively it's like a tier 2 deck, but I don't know, man. Chien-Pao hands has fallen off, though I think it will be a little bit more popular in San Antonio than it was in the other regionals we've been having. But yeah, there you go. That is my tier list. Let me know what you think of it down below. I'll be interested to hear. Thanks for watching the video. I'll leave a link to it if you want to go try it yourself as always. And again, if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe down below. Help me on the road to reaching 10K subs. All that good stuff. Leave a like if you enjoyed, and I will see you all on another video on the second channel here, hopefully soon. Bye-bye.